The runway was in sight, and the pilots were just moments away from landing when, suddenly, the captain's voice cut through the air, sharp and urgent. "You got trees!" But it was too late. The aircraft slammed into the woods, and both pilots lost their lives instantly. What followed was an investigation that revealed several shocking details: arrogant mistakes made in haste, misjudgments, and poor decisions that led to this tragic crash. This is where the story starts. On October 5th, 2021, just before sunrise, two experienced pilots took off from Lubbock, Texas, on what should have been a routine cargo flight to Thomas McDuffie County Airport in Thompson, Georgia. The aircraft they were flying was a Dassault Falcon 20, a low-wing, twin-engine business jet known for its versatility. Although typically used to carry passengers, this particular Falcon 20 had been converted to carry cargo. Despite its modification, the plane was mechanically sound when it crashed. There was no flight data recorder on board, but the Cockpit voice recorder, CVR, provided investigators with a chilling, real-time account of the flight's final moments. Before diving into the investigation's findings, we must first understand the pilots flying the aircraft. The captain in charge was Ray, a 73-year-old seasoned pilot with nearly 12,000 total flight hours, including over 1,600 hours in the Falcon 20. However, the majority of Ray's flight hours were accumulated in single-pilot operations, not as part of a two-pilot crew. This was his first significant experience in a two-pilot operation, and as anyone in aviation knows, effective crew communication is critical to safety. Ray had transitioned to the Falcon 20 in 2017, but faced setbacks early on, including failing a check ride when he lost track of his airspeed and entered a stall condition. While he passed the check ride on his second attempt, this mishap pointed to a larger issue with his decision-making and situational awareness under pressure. Despite this, Ray's crew coordination skills were noted as a concern in his evaluations, and the investigation would later reveal these issues persisted. Sitting next to him in the right seat was Claude, the 63-year-old first officer, with nearly 11,000 flight hours, including over 1,200 hours on the Falcon 20. Claude had a commercial pilot certificate and had been with the company for years, but his performance as a first officer was under scrutiny. He had struggled with aeronautical decision-making, an essential skill for any pilot, especially with so many hours of experience. The investigation revealed that Claude's decision-making had never risen to the level required to become a captain, which calls into question his leadership and judgment skills. Despite this, Ray preferred to fly with Claude, as confirmed by Ray's wife, who noted their camaraderie and the comfort Ray felt flying with him. The flight was supposed to be a simple cargo run, but things quickly went awry. Due to a cargo mix-up, the pilots had to fly an empty plane from their home base in El Paso to Lubbock, Texas, before loading the cargo. By the time they were ready to take off again, they were already over 2 hours behind schedule. This delay would push them into a situation where they were racing against the clock, adding unnecessary stress to an already challenging flight. However, the weather conditions posed an even greater threat. As they approached Georgia, isolated thunderstorms near their destination were reducing visibility. The approach to Thomas McDuffie County Airport was complicated by rain and drizzle, which further reduced visibility along the flight path. The airport, a non-towered facility, had a short runway of only 5,500 feet, and without an approach lighting system, landing here under such conditions was a risky endeavor. The only approach to runway 10, the runway they would be using, was the Instrument Landing System, ILS. The pilot's approach to this runway was critical, but they were already behind schedule and under pressure to land. At this point, the pilots had to contend with the effects of their delayed departure, rushing to complete the flight and make up for lost time. They were flying into poor weather conditions with reduced visibility, on a short runway, without the proper lighting system. The combination of these stressors, Ray's difficulty in communication, and the rushed nature of the flight, created a perfect storm of errors that led to disaster. As we delve deeper into the investigation and the findings of the CVR, we'll see how these critical mistakes played out in the final moments of the flight. The story of this crash serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of crew resource management, situational awareness, and the need to slow down and think clearly, even under pressure. In aviation, timing, communication, and preparation are everything. And in this case, the pilot's failure to prioritize these aspects led to their tragic end. Stay tuned as we continue to break down the critical moments of this flight. There was an important note regarding the ILS approach. The glide path was out of service. This meant that the pilots would have no vertical guidance to the runway, other than the PAPI lights on the left side, a crucial detail for their approach. To provide some context, before they took off from Lubbock, Captain Ray had spoken with the company's dispatch manager. He was explicitly told that there was a possibility of bad weather in Georgia, and if the runway there was wet, it might be too short for landing. In that case, Ray was advised to divert to Augusta, a safer option. Ray was reminded to check the weather and NOTAMs, notices to airmen, before the flight. But according to the investigation, the NTSB never clarified exactly what landing distance would have been required on a wet runway. This leaves open the question of whether the runway would have been too short to land safely. But the critical issue here was the diversion option. After landing in Lubbock and loading the cargo, Ray contacted the company again for an update. The dispatcher repeated the earlier warning. If the McDuffie runway was wet, or if the weather was bad, they should divert to Augusta. However, no mention was made of any NOTAMs that would impact the flight. The dispatcher later claimed that after the crash, he noticed several NOTAMs regarding the ILS. This is important because, according to aviation regulations, it is the pilot's responsibility to review the weather and NOTAMs before every flight. Ray and Claude both should have been aware that the glide path was out of service, which is why pre-flight planning is so critical. Unfortunately, they didn't review these key details, which could have changed the course of the flight. As they prepared for the approach at night, they were essentially set up for a difficult landing. Thunderstorms to dodge, a dark, uncontrolled airport, a short and potentially wet runway, and a localizer-only approach, without any vertical guidance. If they had prepared for all of these factors properly, it may not have been as risky. However, with the company giving them the option to divert, this would have been the perfect time to choose safety and reroute to Augusta. Sadly, they didn't take that route. A few minutes later, Ray and Claude took off on their final flight, unaware of the impending disaster. The flight to Georgia was mostly uneventful, except for the conversations between the two pilots. At some point during the flight, Ray became aware of the NOTAM about the glide path being out of service and made a radio call to the controller to inquire about it. The controller responded with confusion, stating that there was a NOTAM, saying the glide path was inoperable, but also mentioning some confusion about the exact details. For context, GP stands for glide path, and the term unserviceable means that the equipment wasn't functioning. It was surprising that the controller didn't seem to know what GP meant, but what's more alarming is that Ray and Claude, given their experience, didn't have a clear understanding of this critical detail. Instead of pressing the controller for clarification, Ray simply responded with Roger and proceeded with the flight. A few moments later, another controller informed them that the localizer was out of service, but that NOTAM was set to go into effect later that evening. Ray acknowledged his confusion about the NOTAMs, but seemed to assume that the localizer would still be available when they landed, and the controller agreed. The conversation ended without fully addressing the issue of the glide path being out of service. Here's where things went wrong. While the localizer might have remained functional, the glide path was essential for a proper descent, especially given the weather and visibility conditions. By not fully addressing this issue, they had unknowingly set themselves up for failure. In the next 12 minutes, things took a turn for the worse. Ray became increasingly frustrated with Claude, repeatedly raising his voice and questioning his flying ability. The tone in the cockpit grew tense, with Ray demanding that Claude fly the damn airplane. This was not the type of environment any crew member should work in, particularly during a challenging flight at night, with poor visibility and stormy weather. The captain's aggressive approach undermined Claude's confidence and prevented him from speaking up when it mattered most. In aviation, such tension can be dangerous, especially when split-second decisions are required. As they continued their descent, Ray briefly reviewed the approach plate for the runway, but they were already in a precarious situation. Less than 20 minutes later, the controllers cleared them to fly direct to the Cedar waypoint and then direct to McDuffie Airport. Ray had difficulty finding Cedar on the charts, so the controller spelled it out for him. The controller also clarified that Cedar was the initial approach fix for runway 10. An interesting technical detail here is that Cedar refers to a non-directional beacon, NDB. NDBs are radio transmitters that help aircraft navigate by transmitting signals that the aircraft's receiver can pick up. However, relying solely on an NDB for navigation, especially in poor weather, is far from ideal, especially without proper vertical guidance. The pilots were entering a high-risk approach, with several key elements missing: no glide path, reliance on outdated and conflicting NOTAMs, and growing tension in the cockpit. Yet they pushed forward without fully acknowledging the risks. This was a tragic miscalculation of the situation, and the flight was about to take its fatal turn. The identifier for the non-directional beacon, NDB, was actually AA, Alpha Alpha. This seemingly small detail caused a great deal of confusion for Captain Ray, who likely assumed that Cedar was a GPS fix. Struggling to program it into the aircraft's navigation system, Ray found himself in a frustrating bind. This moment highlights the importance of pre-flight planning and taking the time to fully brief the approach. Had they taken just a few minutes to plan ahead and clarify their approach, they might have avoided this confusion. Instead, Ray asked the controller for an initial heading while still descending. As the aircraft approached their assigned altitude, tension in the cockpit was building. Ray shouted, "Altitude!" then followed it up with, "I'll get that. You fly the damn airplane. I don't want you to kill me." Tragically, it would be Ray's actions that led to their demise. Now, it's important to note that Claude, the first officer, wasn't perfect either. It seemed he struggled with basic aircraft control at times, but it also appeared he knew how to load the approach. If Claude had been willing to voice his concerns and ask Ray for assistance, things could have played out differently. Unfortunately, Claude never took that step, and Ray continued to insist that Claude fly the airplane, even as the situation became more chaotic. After struggling for several minutes, Ray finally requested vectors to the final approach course. However, the controller could not provide these vectors because he was focused on handling the en route environment and didn't have the necessary approach charts in front of him. The controller wasn't in a position to legally vector the aircraft, leaving Ray to make a decision. Eventually, Ray gave up on the vectors and took control, asking Claude to load the approach. Yet, less than 2 minutes later, Ray handed the controls right back to Claude. This shift in command further worsened the situation. By this point, the cockpit environment had become toxic. Claude, unsure and unwilling to challenge Ray's commands, remained silent for the remaining 12 minutes of the flight. This lack of communication and cooperation set the stage for the tragic outcome. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, despite poor audio quality, captured the deteriorating atmosphere. While the NTSB suggested that Claude's comments might not have been recorded due to the poor quality, it's more likely that Claude simply became unwilling to speak up. The escalating tension made it impossible for him to challenge Ray, who continued to call out heading, airspeed, and altitude commands. At one point, Ray remarked, "Would you fly the airplane?" "Man, I've been doing everything else." Even though he wasn't truly doing anything except yelling at Claude. Ray was supposed to be acting as the pilot monitoring during the approach, which involved making critical callouts, such as announcing altitudes and other critical parameters. However, he failed to make any of these callouts as required by the company's standard operating procedures. The controller cleared the aircraft for the ILS localizer approach to runway 10. But crucially, the controller never reminded them that the glide slope was out of service. Moments later, Ray told Claude to fly the ILS approach, even though the glide slope wasn't working. This was a critical failure, as the glide slope provides the vertical guidance necessary for a safe approach, especially in poor weather conditions. The pilots were supposed to follow precise instructions as they approached the airport. At CR, the designated fix, they should have turned outbound and continued their descent to 2,200 feet, then no lower than 2,000 feet as they crossed the final approach fix. However, they didn't do this. Instead, they passed by Cedar, still about 600 feet above the expected altitude, and began a right turn toward the airport, completely misaligned with the runway. Ray then reported that they had the runway in sight, which likely meant he assumed they could land visually from there. This assumption led him to focus more on looking outside rather than monitoring the aircraft's instruments. At that point, Ray realized they were still too high and too fast, instructing Claude to deploy the air brakes to slow down. But the Falcon 20's air brakes, though effective, require a delay to deploy and retract, 2 to 3 seconds for deployment and 3 to 4 seconds for retraction. Despite these efforts, the plane remained about 600 feet high and misaligned with the runway until they were about 3 miles out. That's when the rate of descent suddenly increased, and the engines were reduced to idle. As they neared the final approach, Ray again told Claude he was too high, and Claude disagreed, stating that he wasn't. This back and forth created confusion and further slowed the descent rate. Just moments later, Ray instructed Claude to use the air brakes again, but by this time, it was too late. Within seconds, the stall warning sounded and Ray yelled, "You've got trees!" The aircraft was about 7/10 of a mile from the runway when it crashed, killing both pilots instantly. The stall warning was an indication that the aircraft had lost lift and was about to fall from the sky. The root of the problem was not just the technical failures, but the human factors: poor communication, lack of trust, frustration, and disregard for pre-flight preparation. If the pilots had fully briefed the approach, communicated effectively, and taken advantage of the opportunity to divert to Augusta, they might have been able to avoid this tragic end. Unfortunately, the combination of misaligned priorities, tension in the cockpit, and failure to heed crucial warnings led to their fatal crash. This incident serves as a stark reminder of the importance of teamwork, communication, and pre-flight planning in aviation. The problem with using air brakes on the Falcon 20 is that they don't deploy instantly. It takes about 2 to 3 seconds for them to extend and 3 to 4 seconds to retract. This delay might seem small, but at critical moments, every second counts. Even more importantly, the flight manual specifically states that air brakes should not be used during an approach. But despite this, Ray ordered their use while the engines were at idle, hoping to slow the aircraft down. The result? The air brakes, combined with the engines at idle, led to a high rate of descent and a dangerous loss of airspeed. Unfortunately, this danger wasn't recognized until it was too late. What's truly disturbing is that both pilots failed to recognize they were flying an unstable approach. In a situation like this, the appropriate response would have been to go around, abandon the approach, and try again with a fresh perspective. But Ray, instead of admitting the situation was beyond recovery, insisted on using the air brakes, trying to salvage a situation that was spiraling out of control. The flight was quickly moving beyond the point of no return, and they had no margin left for errors. The biggest lesson here is that there's no room for arrogance in the cockpit. If Ray had created a safer, more open environment, Claude might have felt empowered to speak up earlier, pointing out that things were going wrong and suggesting an alternate course of action. Instead, Ray's hostile behavior made it difficult for Claude to express concerns or ask for help. Another critical mistake Ray made was not taking over the controls sooner. Rather than continuing to yell at Claude and forcing him to fly, Ray should have stepped in, especially when the situation began to degrade. In those final moments, taking full control might have given Ray a better chance of stabilizing the aircraft, even if it meant going through the go-around procedure. And of course, it all comes back to pre-flight planning. Had they taken the time to thoroughly review the NOTAMs, they might have noticed the issue with the glide path and made the prudent decision to divert to Augusta. That single decision could have saved their lives. A more careful approach to the flight planning would have highlighted the risks they faced and given them the opportunity to adjust their strategy, perhaps preventing this tragedy entirely. This incident is a stark reminder of the critical role of communication, decision-making, and teamwork in aviation. When pilots fail to collaborate effectively, overlook critical information, and allow emotions to cloud their judgment, the consequences can be disastrous. The tragedy of this flight could have been avoided if the pilots had been more thorough in their preparations and more willing to work together in a moment of crisis. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to learn more about aviation mishaps and how they can be avoided, check out another debrief video on the screen here. And if you found this information valuable, don't forget to sign up for my free Aviation Mishap newsletter, which I send out every Friday. You'll get more in-depth analysis and insights that could help you understand aviation safety better. Visit my website to get your free newsletter today, and thanks again for your support.